They sang like angels, preached like prophets, and then vanished into thin air. No goodbye tours. No final interviews. Just gone. Some say they were called away by a higher power. Others whisper about scandals, tragedies, or secret lives. Today, we dig into the eerie disappearances of 25 gospel legends who vanished without a trace. 1.
And not earth can harm me, aren't you glad?
Dottie Rambo was a gospel music giant, a songwriter whose hymns like We Shall Behold Him and I Go to the Rock became the soundtrack of faith for generations. Yet in her final years, something unsettling happened. She quietly disappeared from the spotlight. The fiery redhead who once shared stages with Elvis and Whitney, who wrote thousands of songs sung in churches worldwide, gradually became a ghost in her own industry. By the mid-2000s, her concerts grew sparse. Her name faded from radio playlists, and the gospel world moved on without fanfare, as if this living legend had already become a memory. The reasons for her vanishing act were never clear. Some whisper about health struggles from decades of grueling tours. Others pointed to gospel music's shifting landscape, where her soul-stirring hymns no longer fit. There was no dramatic retirement, no farewell tour, just a slow retreat from public view. Then in 2008, news of her tragic death in a tour bus accident shocked fans, many of whom gasped, "She was still performing?" The cruel irony was undeniable. Dottie had become invisible while still alive, her absence only noticed in death. 2.
I never leave you.
Andrae Crouch was a gospel music pioneer whose innovative sound bridged traditional hymns with contemporary flair, influencing generations of artists across genres. Yet in the years before his passing in 2015, the man who once collaborated with Michael Jackson and Madonna, who reshaped modern gospel classics like "The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power," seemed to retreat from the spotlight he once commanded. His public appearances grew rare, his voice quieter, as the musical prophet who had spent decades ushering in a new era of worship was now content to step back and let others take the stage. Health challenges and personal struggles marked his later years, but there was no grand farewell, just a gradual fading, as though the industry had already begun memorializing him while he was still here. When news of his death spread, it struck with peculiar ache, the realization that many hadn't noticed his absence until he was truly gone. The choir director who taught the world to sing in a new way had, in the end, slipped away almost unnoticed. 3. Vestal Goodman was the undisputed queen of gospel music, a powerhouse voice whose joyful spirit and electrifying performances made her the heart of the happy Goodman family for decades. Her signature songs like "I Wouldn't Take Nothing for My Journey Now" became anthems of faith, and her beaming smile seemed to radiate pure holiness from every stage she graced. Yet as the new millennium dawned, the woman who had once been the most recognizable face in Southern gospel began to quietly retreat from view, her appearances becoming rare treasures rather than regular occurrences. The reasons for her gradual disappearance were both simple and heartbreaking. The relentless march of time and declining health that comes with a life spent pouring out one's soul in ministry. There was no dramatic announcement when she stopped touring regularly, no farewell concert to mark the end of an era. The gospel industry, always moving forward, continued its relentless pace while Vestal's legendary voice became confined mostly to old recordings and cherished memories. When she passed in 2003, it felt less like a sudden tragedy and more like the quiet closing of a book that had already been slowly finishing its final chapters. For
Our weakness.
Lord, you know.
He'll give us.
Jesse Dixon brought a rare electricity to gospel music, his soaring vocals and charismatic stage presence, making him one of the most dynamic performers of his generation. From his early days with the Jesse Dixon Singers to his groundbreaking collaborations with Paul Simon on tour, he shattered barriers and infused gospel with vibrant, contemporary energy that captivated audiences across racial and musical divides. Yet as the 2000s progressed, the man who had once been a ubiquitous force in both sacred and secular circles began to quietly withdraw from the spotlight, his appearances becoming increasingly sporadic until he seemed to vanish from the scene altogether. The industry's shift toward younger artists and changing musical tastes likely played a role in his fading presence. But Jesse's retreat felt more intentional than most. There were no press releases about retirement, no comeback attempts, just a gradual stepping away that left fans wondering about the man behind timeless songs like I Am Redeemed, when he passed in 2011 after a brief illness. Many were shocked to realize how long it had been since they'd last heard that magnificent voice. The artist who had once brought down houses with his electrifying performances had spent his final years in relative obscurity. His absence only truly felt in his passing. 5. Tramaine Hawkins' voice was a seismic force in gospel music, an instrument of such raw power and spiritual conviction that it could shake the rafters of any church and transcend into mainstream consciousness with ease. Her 1986 masterpiece, Fall Down, didn't just cross over, it exploded boundaries, fusing gospel fervor with club-ready beats in a way that felt both revolutionary and timeless. Yet for all her electrifying presence during gospel's golden age, Tramaine's trajectory took an unexpected turn as the new millennium arrived. The singer who had once dominated the charts and award ceremonies began releasing music less frequently, her public appearances becoming special events rather than regular occurrences. There was no single reason for this gradual retreat from the spotlight, no scandal, no dramatic retirement announcement. Some attributed it to the natural evolution of an artist who had already given decades to ministry through music. Others whisper about the industry's shifting priorities. With the unapologetically spiritual content Tramaine excelled at no longer fit neatly into commercial boxes. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. One of gospel's most thrilling voices became increasingly absent just as a new generation of singers emerged who cited her as their primary influence. Her occasional returns, like 2011's I Never Lost My Praise, served as potent reminders of what the genre had been missing, making her absences between projects all the more noticeable. 6. Walter Hawkins was a quiet revolutionary of gospel music, a velvet-voiced innovator whose 1975 masterpiece, Love Alive, reshaped the sound of black worship forever. With his brother Edwin in the Love Center Choir, he crafted a lush, soulful sound that made the heavenly feel accessible, transforming churches into dance floors and sermons into soul-stirring melodies. Yet as the 1990s gave way to a new century, the bishop who had once been at the vanguard of gospel's contemporary movement began stepping back from recording and performing with increasing frequency. The man who gave us Going Up Yonder and Change started becoming more legend than presence, his musical output slowing to a trickle while his influence continued flowing through generations of artists he inspired. His retreat wasn't so much a disappearance as a gradual transfer of energy, from creating music to shepherding his Oakland congregation, from touring to mentoring younger ministers. Health challenges in his later years certainly played a role, but there was something almost intentional about how Hawkins, who had always blended ministry and music seamlessly, chose to emphasize his pastoral calling as time went on. When he passed in 2010 after a battle with pancreatic cancer, the grief was compounded by the realization that this gentle giant had been gifting us with fewer musical offerings for years, as if preparing the world for his eventual departure. 7. Rance Allen was a gospel firebrand whose electrifying voice and genre-defying sound blurred the lines between sanctified preaching and soulful revelry. With his brothers in the Rance Allen group, he pioneered a revolutionary blend of gospel, funk, and R&B that made the Holy Ghost feel dangerously alive, turning songs like Ain't No Need to Cry and I Belong to You into spiritual explosions. Yet as the decades rolled on, the high-energy performer, who could out-sing and out-shout anyone, began appearing less frequently, his once constant presence on the gospel circuit becoming more of a special occasion than a regular fixture. There was no dramatic exit, just the natural slowing of a man who had spent his life pouring every ounce of himself into ministry through music. Health challenges in his later years certainly contributed, but Rance's gradual retreat also reflected his quiet wisdom. He seemed content to let younger artists take the spotlight while he focused on pastoring his Toledo church. When he passed in 2020, the outpouring of love revealed an uncomfortable truth. Many fans hadn't realized how much they'd missed him until he was truly gone. The raw power of his voice had become so ingrained in gospel's DNA that its absence went unnoticed until it was irreplaceable. 8.
Will he remember me? Oh, when
Albertina Walker was the undisputed queen of gospel music, a regal presence whose commanding voice and unwavering devotion defined an era. For over 6 decades, she carried the torch of traditional gospel with dignity and power, leading the Caravans and nurturing talents like Shirley Caesar and Inez Andrews. Her thunderous performances on classics like Please Be Patient With Me and I Can Go to God in Prayer set the standard for what gospel music could be, both spiritually profound and artistically exceptional. Yet as the 21st century dawned, the woman who had been a constant force in gospel began stepping back from the spotlight with quiet grace. There was no grand farewell, no final bow, just a gradual retreat that mirrored the natural progression of a life well lived. The industry that had once revolved around her mighty voice continued moving forward, chasing new sounds and younger stars, while Albertina's legacy became something people revered more than actively celebrated. When she passed in 2010 at age 81, it felt less like a sudden loss and more like the closing of a book that had already reached its beautiful conclusion. The tributes poured in, but many recognized with bittersweet clarity that gospel's matriarch had been slowly slipping away for years before her physical departure. 9. Shirley Caesar was a force of nature in gospel music, a pint-sized powerhouse whose voice carried the weight of generations and whose stage presence could electrify entire stadiums. For over 70 years, she stood as one of the last living connections to gospel's golden age, moving seamlessly from her early days with the Caravans to her reign as a first lady of gospel. Her signature songs, No Charge, Hold My Mule, Jesus, I Love Calling Your Name, became the soundtrack of black worship, blending raw emotional power with deep theological truth. Yet in recent years, the whirlwind energy that once defined her ministry has quieted to a gentle breeze, her public appearances becoming rare treasures rather than regular occurrences. The slowing down came gradually, as it must for someone who spent a lifetime running spiritual marathons. There was no dramatic retirement announcement from the woman who famously sang about pressing on, just a natural transition into her 80s with fewer concerts, fewer recordings, but no less devotion. The industry that once relied on her constant presence now treats her more like a cherished relic, trotting her out for Lifetime Achievement Awards while the day-to-day work of gospel moves forward without her. Her 2017 Grammy win for Fill This House proved her voice still carried its miraculous power, but also highlighted how exceptional her performances had become in their rarity. 10. The Clark sisters revolutionized gospel music with their fiery harmonies and electrifying performances, blending traditional holiness with contemporary flair in a way that changed the genre forever. From their early days in Detroit under the guidance of their mother, Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, to global stardom with hits like You Brought the Sunshine and Is My Living in Vain, they became the gold standard for gospel sister groups. Yet as the years passed, the once inseparable quartet began appearing less frequently as a complete unit, their collective light dimming as each sister pursued individual paths. Some in ministry, others stepping away from music entirely. Jackie Clark Chisholm, the eldest, became the most elusive, retreating from public view while her sisters continued performing in various configurations. Twinkie Clark maintained her musical presence, but focused more on behind-the-scenes composing and directing. The group's occasional reunions, like their 2007 comeback album Live One Last Time and their 2020 biopic, only highlighted how rare their collective magic had become. The world that once couldn't get enough of their signature whoops and runs now had to settle for glimpses rather than sustained brilliance from all four sisters together. 11. Vanessa Bell Armstrong emerged in the 1980s as one of gospel music's most thrilling voices, a singer whose technical brilliance and emotional depth placed her among the genre's elite. Her soaring performances on classics like Peace Be Still and Nobody But Jesus showcased a rare ability to convey both heavenly grandeur and raw human vulnerability. Yet as the new millennium unfolded, the powerhouse vocalist who had once been a staple on gospel stages and charts began an inexplicable retreat from the spotlight. Album releases became sporadic, then ceased altogether. Concert appearances grew infrequent, and the industry that had celebrated her seemed to move on without explanation. There was no dramatic exit, no farewell tour, just a quiet fading that left fans puzzling over her absence. Some speculated about personal struggles. Others pointed to gospel music's shifting landscape, where her brand of sophisticated, ministry-driven music no longer found easy purchase. Whatever the reasons, the effect was undeniable. One of the most gifted vocalists of her generation simply vanished at the height of her artistic maturity. Occasional sightings, a guest appearance here, a tribute concert there, only deepened the mystery, offering fleeting reminders of what gospel had lost without satisfying explanations for her withdrawal. 12. The Winans family stood as gospel music's royal dynasty, a collective of siblings whose smooth harmonies and crossover appeal brought sacred music into mainstream consciousness during the 1980s and 90s. With hits like Ain't No Need to Worry and Let My People Go, brothers Beebe, Cece, Marvin, Carvin, Ronald, and the rest of the clan redefined what gospel could sound like, blending R&B sophistication with unwavering spiritual conviction. Yet as time passed, the family that once dominated both sacred and secular charts began to fragment, their collective presence diminishing as individual members pursued solo careers, ministry work, or stepped away from music entirely. The most poignant absence was Ronald Winans, whose velvety baritone anchored the group's richest harmonies before his untimely death in 2005. Other brothers like Marvin and Carvin gradually retreated from touring, while Beebe and Cece, though remaining active, no longer commanded the cultural spotlight they once did. The Winans' unified front, once their greatest strength, became fractured by time, tragedy, and the natural divergences of adult lives. Even their famous Christmas concerts, long a Detroit tradition, eventually faded into memory. 13. John P. Kia was a gospel firebrand who stormed onto the scene in the 1990s with his New Life Community Choir, delivering a raw, unfiltered sound that made holiness feel urgent and alive. His anthems like Jesus is Real and Stand became the heartbeat of black churches, blending streetwise swagger with deep reverence in a way that spoke directly to a generation. Yet for all his early ubiquity, Key's presence in gospel's mainstream gradually waned as the 2000s progressed. The pastor-musician who once dominated award shows and album charts began releasing music less frequently, his public appearances becoming more localized to his North Carolina ministry rather than the national stage he once commanded. There was no dramatic fall from grace, just a quiet recalibration of priorities. Key seemed to consciously step back from the industry machine, focusing on building his Charlotte church community while resisting gospel music's push toward crossover appeal. Occasional albums still emerged like 2015's The Life of Jesus, but they carried the mark of a man more concerned with ministry than marketability. Where once his name was synonymous with gospel's cutting edge, younger listeners now often discover him as a foundational influence rather than a current hitmaker. 14.
The Lord wasn't joking when he kicked him out of Eden. It wasn't for no reason.
Helen Baylor burst onto the gospel scene in the early 1990s like a revelation, her rich, smoky voice carrying both the scars of her past struggles and the radiant joy of her hard-won redemption. With albums like Highly Recommended and Start All Over, she became the voice of second chances, testifying through song about addiction, recovery, and God's unshakable grace. Her music felt like sitting in someone's living room, intimate, honest, and charged with spiritual electricity. Yet as the new millennium unfolded, the woman whose testimony had inspired thousands began stepping back from the spotlight with little explanation. The albums came less frequently, the tours shortened, and gospel's most relatable songsters gradually became more memory than presence. There was no dramatic exit, just a quiet retreat that mirrored the humility that always defined her ministry. Some speculated health challenges played a role. Others sensed Baylor had simply said what she needed to say. Unlike many artists who chase relevance, she seemed at peace letting her existing catalog speak for itself. Occasional appearances, a guest spot here, a featured vocal there. only emphasized how much her full-throated brand of musical testimony had been missed. When she did resurface, like on 2016's The Live Experience, that signature voice remained untouched by time, still able to wring tears and shouts from a single phrase. 15. Commission stood as one of gospel music's most formidable groups during their 1980s and 90s heyday. Their intricate harmonies and progressive sound pushing the genre forward with albums like State of Mind and Number 7, with members like Marvin Sapp, Fred Hammond, and Mitchell Jones. They weren't just a vocal group, but a collective of powerhouse talents who would each go on to shape gospel music in their own right. Yet as the years passed, the once unified ensemble began to splinter, not with drama or discord, but through the quiet, inevitable drift of individual callings. Some members like Hammond and Sapp ascended to solo stardom, while others, most notably Mitchell Jones, seemed to vanish from music entirely, leaving fans to wonder about their whereabouts. Jones' disappearance became particularly puzzling. Once a central voice on commission classics like Running Back to You, he stepped away from the public eye in the late 1990s without explanation. Unlike his bandmates who maintained visible ministries, Jones retreated completely. No interviews, no comeback attempts, just silence. The contrast was striking. While Commission's legacy grew through occasional reunions and the continued success of alumni, some of its original voices became ghosts in the very genre they helped build. Even the group's later iterations, carrying the name forward with new members, only underscore how profoundly the original collective had dispersed. 16. The Hawkins family was gospel music's first dynasty, a sprawling collective of siblings and cousins whose voices define an entire era of sacred music. Led by the indomitable Edwin Hawkins, their 1969 hit, Oh Happy Day, didn't just cross over, it shattered barriers, bringing gospel into mainstream consciousness with a joy that was impossible to resist. Yet after Edwin's passing in 2018, the family that had once moved as a unified musical force began to disperse like leaves in the wind. The loss of their visionary leader seemed to dissolve the last threads holding their collective ministry together, leaving fans to wonder what had become of the remaining Hawkins voices. Some members, like Walter's protege Tramaine Hawkins, continued performing but under their own banners. Others retreated from music entirely, their absence unexplained. The family reunions that once brought multiple generations of Hawkins singers to the stage became rare events, then memories. Even the famous Love Center Church in Oakland, long the family's spiritual and musical home, could no longer sustain the vibrant musical presence it once had. The Hawkins sound, that perfect alchemy of classical training, Pentecostal fire, and R&B sensibility, now exists primarily in recordings, its living practitioners scattered across different churches and callings. 17. Daryl Coley was a vocal marvel, a gospel artist whose staggering range and technical precision left audiences breathless and critics scrambling for superlatives. With a voice that could effortlessly glide from operatic heights to jazz-inflected riffs, he redefined what gospel singing could be in the 1980s and 90s through timeless recordings like When the Music Stops and He's Right on Time. Yet as the new century progressed, Coley's once prominent presence in gospel began to fade, his name appearing less frequently on programs, and his recordings becoming rare events. The man who could silence rooms with his otherworldly instrument was gradually being silenced by the industry itself. Health struggles played a significant role in his retreat. A battle with cancer and other ailments sapped the energy of a performer who had once seemed superhuman. But there was also a sense that Coley's brand of sophisticated, musically complex gospel no longer fit neatly into the genre's evolving landscape. Where once his 7-octave range was celebrated, the spotlight now favored simpler, more commercial sounds. His occasional appearances, like a stunning 2010 performance at the Gospel Music Workshop of America, served as potent reminders of what gospel was missing, making his absences between shows all the more noticeable. When Coley passed in 2016, the tributes poured in from artists who considered him a vocal mentor, but the outpouring couldn't mask an uncomfortable truth. Many in gospel had failed to properly honor this genius while he was still here to receive it. Today, his recordings stand as monuments to a kind of artistry rarely seen in the genre, their brilliance undimmed by time. Daryl Coley's story is gospel music's great paradox, How an instrument of such celestial power could be allowed to fade from view, leaving behind only echoes of what might have been if more ears had truly listened. 18. The Barrett Sisters were gospel royalty, a trio whose tight familial harmonies and electrifying stage presence made them one of the most beloved groups in sacred music. Led by the formidable Deloise Barrett Campbell, their rich blend of traditional gospel and jazz influences produced timeless classics like Jesus Will Fix It and Mary, Don't You Weep. For decades, they were fixtures on the gospel circuit, their performances marked by Deloise's commanding contralto and the sisters' uncanny vocal chemistry. Yet as the 1990s gave way to a new century, the group that had once been synonymous with Chicago gospel began to fade from view, their appearances growing sporadic before stopping altogether. Deloise's retreat from the spotlight was gradual but unmistakable. The sister who had been the group's anchor and standout voice began performing less frequently, her absence leaving a void that couldn't be filled. Health challenges played a role, but there was also a sense that the Barrett Sisters' brand of unapologetically traditional gospel no longer commanded the attention it once did. When Deloise passed in 2011, it felt like the closing of a chapter that had already been quietly ending for years. The tributes poured in, but many more not just her passing, but the long absence that preceded it. The slow disappearance of a voice that had once been gospel's gold standard. 19. The Angelic gospel singers emerged from Philadelphia in the 1940s as one of gospel's pioneering female groups, their crisp harmonies and fervent delivery capturing the raw power of storefront church spirituality. With Margaret Allison's piercing lead vocals driving classics like Touch Me, Lord Jesus, and I've Got It, they became fixtures of the gospel highway, their sound embodying the golden age of quartet-style holiness music. Yet as the decades passed and gospel evolved, the group that had once stood at the genre's forefront began to fade from view, their name appearing less frequently on programs until they became more memory than active presence. Their disappearance wasn't sudden but incremental, a gradual receding as member changes and shifting musical tastes rendered their traditional sound less prominent. Margaret Allison's eventual retirement marked the true end of an era. As the last original member stepped away from the group she had led for over half a century. Unlike some groups that reinvent themselves with new members, the Angelic seemed content to let their legacy stand intact rather than dilute it, their absence growing more pronounced with each passing year. By the time Allison passed in 2008, many younger gospel fans barely knew the group that had once been trailblazers. 20. The Caravans were more than a gospel group. They were a sacred institution, a proving ground for some of the greatest voices the genre would ever know. Under the leadership of Albertina Walker, this revolving ensemble of talent launched the careers of legends like Shirley Caesar, Inez Andrews, and Bessie Griffin throughout the 1950s and 60s. Their recordings, Mary Don't You Weep, Walk Around Heaven, became the blueprint for what group gospel could achieve, blending individual virtuosity with heavenly ensemble work. Yet as the golden age of gospel quartets and groups waned, the Caravans' once dominant presence began to dissolve, not with final bow, but through the quiet, inevitable drift of time and changing tastes. By the 1980s, the group existed mostly in reunions and revivals, their classic lineup long since scattered to solo careers and other callings. Albertina Walker kept the name alive with new configurations, but the magic of those original Caravans, the explosive combination of voices that could make a church tremble, became increasingly rare. When surviving members reunited, it was often tinged with melancholy. The passing of Andrews in 2012 and Walker in 2010 made clear that an era was slipping away. The group that had once been a well-oiled machine now struggled to recapture its former glory with missing parts and aging voices. 21.
Well, maybe not. But when you look for 300 people, you don't see but 20.
The Dixie Hummingbirds soared for nearly a century as gospel music's most enduring institution, their tight harmonies and show-stopping performances setting the standard for male quartets since the 1920s. With Ira Tucker Sr.'s electrifying lead vocals driving classics like Loves Me Like a Rock, they bridged the gap between traditional Jubilee singing and modern gospel soul. Yet as the 21st century progressed, the group that had outlasted countless trends began showing signs of the inevitable. Original members passed away, performances grew less frequent, and the Hummingbirds' once constant presence in gospel became more nostalgic than active. Ira Tucker Jr., who had taken up his father's mantle as keeper of the Hummingbirds' legacy, found himself leading a group whose golden era belonged increasingly to history. The challenge became stark: how to honor an institution's past while keeping it relevant. Occasional high-profile appearances, like their 2003 Grammy-winning collaboration with Stevie Wonder, proved the magic could still spark, but the flames burned less consistently. By the time Tucker Jr. passed in 2020, the Hummingbirds had already transitioned from living legend to beloved artifact. Their once vital sound now preserved primarily in recordings rather than regular performances. Today, the Dixie Hummingbirds exist in that delicate space between memory and living tradition. A version of the group still performs with younger members, but the direct lineage, that unbroken thread back to the 1920s, has frayed with time. Their story mirrors gospel's own evolution. What was once the heartbeat of the genre now resides in museums and tribute concerts, celebrated more for its historical importance than its current impact. The birds still sing, but the forest has grown around them. Their melodies now part of the landscape rather than cutting through it like they once did. Their gradual disappearance wasn't a failure, but the natural order. No group, no matter how mighty, can fly forever. 22. Reverend Milton Brunson and the Thompson Community Singers were the heartbeat of Chicago gospel for over 50 years. Their robust choir sound setting the template for modern mass choir music, with powerhouse soloists like Daryl Coley and Orlando Draper emerging from their ranks. They delivered timeless anthems like I'm Still Holding On and Safe in His Arms that became the soundtrack of black church life. Yet after Brunson's passing in 1997, the mighty ensemble that had once been synonymous with gospel excellence began a quiet retreat from the national stage. The choir continued under new directors, but the unmistakable spiritual gravity Brunson brought, that perfect alchemy of musical precision and Pentecostal fire, proved impossible to fully replicate. The Thompson Community Singers didn't disappear so much as they gradually returned to their roots, becoming more local treasure than touring phenomenon. Where once they filled auditoriums nationwide, their presence became concentrated in Chicago's churches and gospel events, their recordings less frequent. The choir that had been a launching pad for so many stars now focused on nurturing community voices rather than chasing industry trends. Occasional reunions of classic lineup members served as bittersweet reminders of what had been. The musical family Brunson built still intact, but no longer the dominant force it once was. 23. The Swan Silvertones, led by the incomparable Claude Jeter, were architects of gospel's golden age, their ethereal harmonies and innovative arrangements forever changing the sound of sacred music. Jeter's falsetto, airy yet piercing, on classics like Mary, Don't You Weep, didn't just influence gospel. It shaped the very foundation of soul music, with artists like Al Green and Curtis Mayfield citing him as a primary inspiration. Yet as the 1960s waned and musical tastes evolved, the group that had once been at gospel's vanguard began a slow, almost imperceptible retreat from the spotlight. Their recordings became sporadic. Their once constant touring schedule dwindled, and the Silvertones' celestial sound gradually faded from mainstream gospel consciousness. Claude Jeter's eventual transition to secular music as a member of the mainstream group, the Jets, marked a quiet departure from the gospel world he had helped define. Unlike some artists who made grand returns, Jeter never fully reclaimed his place in the genre he revolutionized. The original Swan Silvertones dissolved, leaving behind recordings that sounded decades ahead of their time, but with no active torchbearers to keep their specific flame alive. By the time Jeter passed in 2009, many younger gospel fans only knew his name through liner notes or the occasional sample in hip-hop tracks, unaware they were hearing the echoes of a man who had once reshaped black sacred music. 24. Dorothy Norwood was gospel music's consummate storyteller, a fiery evangelist with a microphone whose dramatic narratives like The Denied Mother and Somebody Prayed for Me turned songs into full-fledged sermons. As both a Caravans alumna and successful solo artist, she commanded stages with a presence that blended Southern holiness fervor with big city sophistication. Yet as the 2000s progressed, the woman who had once been a constant force on the gospel circuit began stepping back with quiet intention. Her recordings became fewer, her tours shorter, until the industry that had once relied on her powerhouse testimonies realized she was no longer a fixture, but a special occasion. There was no farewell tour, no dramatic announcement, just a gradual withdrawal that mirrored the natural arc of a woman who had given decades to the road. Younger artists still spoke her name with reverence, but Norwood herself seemed content to let her extensive catalog speak for itself. Occasional appearances, like her stunning 2015 performance at the Chicago Gospel Music Festival, proved the voice still carried its trademark authority, but these moments only highlighted how rare they had become. The singer who had once made audiences weep with her vivid musical parables now seemed most comfortable in the background, her wisdom passed on quietly to the next generation rather than blasted from stages. 25. Thomas Whitfield was a gospel innovator whose lush arrangements and sophisticated compositions elevated choir music to new artistic heights in the 1980s. His groundbreaking work with the Whitfield Company on albums like Hallelujah Anyhow and I'm Encouraged blended classical precision with Pentecostal fire, creating a sound that was as technically stunning as it was spiritually potent. Yet at the peak of his creative powers in 1992, the 42-year-old maestro suddenly passed away, leaving behind not just grief, but an unsettling void in gospel music. His abrupt departure felt like a musical sentence cut mid-phrase. So much potential left unrealized, so many compositions unwritten. In the years before his death, Whitfield had already begun pulling back from constant touring, focusing more on behind-the-scenes work as a producer and mentor. Some interpreted this as creative exhaustion. Others saw an artist maturing into new phases of ministry. But his sudden death transformed what might have been a natural evolution into a permanent absence. The choirs he trained, the musicians he influenced, even the artists who covered his songs, all were left to wonder what more Whitfield might have achieved had time allowed.